At my daughter's housewarming party, in front of 40 guests and her 8-year-old son, she dropped her mother's recipe book into the recycling bin by the kitchen door. "We're not keeping clutter that smells like a thrift store," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. My grandson Tyler looked up at me with his grandmother's gray eyes, and I saw something break quietly behind them. I said nothing. I simply walked to the bin, reached past the wine bottles and paper napkins, and pulled the book out. I wiped the cover with my sleeve the way Maggie always wiped her hands before she cooked, careful, deliberate, with full attention. Then I looked at my daughter Nicole, 39 years old, designer kitchen, life she'd built on choices I was only beginning to understand. I carried the book to my car. 3 days later, a retired professor named Walt Greer opened it on his work table and sat back in his chair, like the air had been knocked out of him. "My name is Frank Patterson. I'm 67 years old, retired civil engineer, former Army Corps, widower for 18 months. Maggie and I were married 41 years. She was a home economics teacher who spent every weekend in the kitchen not because she had to, but because she believed feeding people was the closest thing to prayer she'd ever found. That recipe book was her life's work, handwritten entries going back to 1979, the year we got married. Chocolate cake recipes with margin notes. Christmas cookie variations. A pot roast that Tyler once said tasted like Grandma herself. Nicole had dropped it in the recycling bin, without blinking. I drove home through the November rain with the book on the passenger seat. Our house in Clarksburg, Maryland, was quieter than I'd ever known a house to be. I set the book on the kitchen table, the same table where Maggie had stood for 4 decades, and I made coffee, and I tried to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't grief exactly. I'd done most of that already. It was something sharper. Recognition. Maggie had pressed something into my hand the last week she was conscious. She'd been home on hospice, the kind of home that feels rearranged by illness into something almost unrecognizable. Her hands were still strong. She'd pulled me close to her and she'd said, quietly so only I could hear, "Frank, that recipe book holds more than recipes. Promise me you'll keep it safe. Don't let Nicole have it. Let Tyler have it when the time is right." I'd squeezed her hand and told her I promised. She'd nodded once and closed her eyes. She passed 4 days later. I hadn't thought much about her words. I assumed she meant it sentimentally, that she wanted the book preserved, not thrown in a donation pile. But sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, I remembered how deliberately she'd said it. More than recipes. Maggie had been precise with language her whole life. She didn't waste words any more than she wasted ingredients. I turned the book over in my hands, held it the way Tommy Morrison had taught me when we used to go to estate sales together, checking weight first. My old college roommate Walt Greer had spent 30 years as a professor of American history before retiring to open a small, rare documents appraisal business outside of Frederick. I'd called him that night. He told me to bring it by Friday morning. Walt's shop sat in a converted farmhouse with a sign out front that said Greer Historical Appraisals in plain black letters. He was 70, white-bearded, with reading glasses that he wore on his forehead more than on his face. He set the recipe book on a clean felt mat under a ring light and went quiet for a long time. He turned pages slowly, ran his fingers along the spine. Then he reached the back section, the recipes for preserves and canning that Maggie had added late in the 1990s. He pressed his thumb along the inside back cover and paused. He reached for a thin letter opener. "Frank," he said, "this cover is thicker than it should be." There was a soft crack as the false backing separated from the board beneath it. Walt lifted the inner panel and set it aside. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper and sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, were 2 documents. The first was a notarized deed. The second was a letter in Maggie's handwriting. Walt read the deed first. Then he sat back and removed his glasses. "Do you know anything about a parcel on Garner Ridge Road in Berkeley County, West Virginia?" he asked. I stared at him. "That's my grandfather's land. He left it to my mother. When my mother passed, I assumed it went, I don't know. I never followed up." Walt handed me the deed. It was a mineral rights conveyance, signed by my mother in 1987, transferring 60% of all subsurface mineral rights on the Garner Ridge parcel to Margaret Ann Patterson in trust for Tyler James Patterson. My mother had loved Maggie. Apparently, she'd loved her enough to quietly reroute a significant portion of her estate through her. "What's on Garner Ridge?" Walt asked. I told him I hadn't been there in 30 years. He was already on his laptop. He went quiet for 3 full minutes. Then he turned the screen toward me. Natural gas development had come to Berkeley County in 2019. 3 separate energy companies had purchased mineral rights across the ridge. The going rate per acre had been, according to the most recent public filing Walt pulled, between $40,000 and $60,000 per acre for producing rights. The Garner Ridge parcel was 212 acres. I grabbed the edge of his work table. "Somewhere between $8 and $12 million, Walt said softly. "Potentially more, depending on what's under there. And this is registered in trust for your grandson." He picked up the letter. "From your wife." I read it standing up because my legs wouldn't bend. "My dearest Tyler," Maggie had written, "your great-grandmother Frances wanted the land to stay in the family, and she trusted me to make sure it did. I didn't tell your grandfather because I didn't want him to feel the pressure of it. I didn't tell your mother because I knew she would find a way to redirect what your great-grandmother intended. If you're reading this, your grandfather kept his promise to keep this book safe. He always keeps his promises. Use this land wisely, sweetheart. Use it the way Frances would have wanted to build a life no one can take from you. All my love, Grandma Maggie." I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, my hands had stopped shaking enough to hold the paper steady. Walt said the deed was legitimate, properly notarized, properly filed in Berkeley County records. My mother had done it cleanly, with a real estate attorney. All of it was airtight. "Nicole doesn't know," I said. "No," Walt agreed. "And Nicole just threw away the only document trail connecting your wife to this trust." He looked at me carefully. "Except for the original records, which are still in the county clerk's office. These are certified copies. My daughter had thrown $8 to $12 million in a recycling bin. She'd thrown her son's future in a recycling bin, because it smelled like a thrift store." I drove home in silence. I made dinner. I sat at Maggie's kitchen table until it was dark, and then I called an attorney named Susan Park, who had handled Maggie's estate and came recommended by 3 people I trusted. She answered on the 2nd ring. I told her I needed to come in Monday morning. She told me to bring everything. Susan's office was in Rockville, clean and practical. Not the kind of place designed to impress you with how expensive everything was. She read the deed and the letter twice, asked me 4 clarifying questions, and then wrote 2 pages of notes without looking up. "The trust is valid," she said. "Tyler is the sole beneficiary. You are named as trustee, which means you control administration until he reaches 25. Nicole has no legal claim on these assets." She paused in a way that told me something harder was coming. "Here's what concerns me. Nicole and her husband Brandon, what do they know about your finances?" I thought about that. Brandon Holt was 42, worked in commercial real estate development, understood property values and mineral rights better than most. If he ever looked into Maggie's family connections, if he ever pulled property records in Berkeley County looking for anything, he could find the trust in the public record, Susan said. Not the documents in the book, but the deed itself was filed. Anyone who knew to look for it could find it. She tapped her pen on the desk. "Frank, how is your relationship with Nicole and Brandon right now?" I told her about the party, about the recipe book, about the way Brandon had looked at me across the room when I'd picked it up. Not angry, exactly, but assessing. The way you look at an obstacle you're calculating. "I want you to hire an investigator," Susan said. She wrote a name and number on a notepad and slid it across the desk. "Her name is Diane Chu, former IRS, now private practice. She's the best I know. If Brandon has been doing research on your family's assets, Diane will find the trail." I called Diane from the parking garage. She told me she could start within 48 hours. She called me back in 5 days. I met her at a diner in Silver Spring, where she spread a thin folder on the table between our coffee cups. Brandon Holt pulled Berkeley County property records 8 weeks ago, she said. Online records search, paid county portal. He searched your mother's name, Frances Patterson, and your wife's name, Margaret Patterson. He found the deed filing. She turned a page. He didn't find the trust beneficiary name because that portion of the document was redacted in the public portal standard privacy protection for minor beneficiaries. But he knows the land exists and that Maggie held rights to it. I set my coffee down. There's more. Diane turned another page. Brandon's current development company, Holt Ridge Partners, is under review by the Maryland Real Estate Commission for misrepresenting investor distributions on 2 commercial projects. He owes approximately $2 million in personal guarantees that are coming due in March. He's been trying to restructure and failing. She looked at me directly. He needs a large sum of money in the next 4 months, Frank, and he now knows your family has land worth potentially $10 million. He'll come after the trust, I said. He'll come after you first, Diane corrected. The trust is airtight as long as you're trustee. The fastest way to get to the money is to remove you. I'd heard that word before. In a context I understood. Conservatorship, the legal mechanism by which a family member could petition a court to declare an elderly relative incompetent and seize control of their assets, their decisions, their life. Brandon researched elder guardianship law in Maryland 3 weeks ago, Diane said quietly. She showed me a screenshot of browser searches tied to a device registered to his office. He's been reading case law. I called Susan from the parking lot. She told me to come back in the next morning. At 9 a.m., we sat across from each other again, and Susan laid out what she called the next 30 days. We assume Brandon files a conservatorship petition within the month, she said. We prepare your defense now, before he moves. That means a full cognitive evaluation, character witnesses, documentation of your independent life, and counter-evidence of his financial motivations. She paused. We also need to talk about Tyler. I looked at her. Diane found flight research, Susan said. Brandon has been looking at property in the Cayman Islands. Searched international school options for an 8-year-old in the Caribbean. He also searched custody laws in jurisdictions with limited cooperation agreements with the United States. The room went cold. He's planning to take Tyler out of the country, I said. He can't access the trust with you as trustee, Susan said. But if he relocates Tyler internationally, gets established in a jurisdiction that doesn't extradite, and then challenges the trust through foreign courts, it becomes extraordinarily complicated. He'd lose eventually, but it could take years. Years in which he could find ways to monetize the mineral rights himself, using Tyler's name, with no oversight. She met my eyes. Frank, Tyler is not just his stepson in this scenario. Tyler is the vehicle to $8 million. I thought about Tyler at the party, watching his grandmother's book go into the recycling bin. 8 years old, patient, quiet. The kind of child who absorbed everything without complaining about it. Maggie had seen something in him early, called him her old soul. Said he thought before he spoke, which was rare. We move first, I said. The cognitive evaluation was at Johns Hopkins, arranged through Susan's network, Dr. James Whitfield, a neuropsychologist whose reputation in Baltimore courts was irreproachable, put me through 4 hours of testing on a Tuesday morning. Memory, reasoning, spatial cognition, executive function. I answered questions, sorted shapes, repeated sequences, drew a clock face that he examined for 3 full minutes without expression. His report arrived Thursday. Frank Patterson demonstrates cognitive function consistent with the superior range for his age group. No indicators of dementia, vascular impairment, or executive dysfunction. He is fully competent to manage personal affairs, financial decisions, and fiduciary responsibilities. Susan filed the evaluation with the court on a precautionary basis, time-stamped before any petition existed. She called it setting the record straight before Brandon tried to make the record dirty. The petition arrived on a Wednesday. Brandon had moved faster than we expected. The document was 40 pages of careful lies. It cited my obsessive attachment to deceased spouse's belongings, described my behavior at the housewarming party as erratic and emotionally dysregulated, and included a psychiatric evaluation from a doctor, Raymond Fossey, who had apparently concluded, based on a 1-hour observation arranged by Brandon without my knowledge, that I showed signs consistent with complicated grief disorder and diminished capacity for sound judgment. Raymond Fossey had testified in 11 conservatorship cases in 2 years. He had testified for the petitioner in every single one. Hearing date: 32 days away. Susan moved immediately. She subpoenaed Fossey's financial records and found a $15,000 wire transfer from Brandon's personal account 4 days before the evaluation date. She pulled Fossey's disciplinary record and found a formal complaint in Virginia for providing biased testimony in an inheritance dispute, settled quietly with conditions. She found 3 former clients willing to testify that he had pre-written his conclusions before meeting them. Diane found something else. Nicole had called a boarding school in Nassau, Bahamas twice in the past 3 weeks. She'd requested enrollment materials for a family transition and described Tyler as a child who would benefit from structured residential education. She'd given a tentative start date of next semester. Brandon had told Tyler, according to his school counselor's notes which Susan obtained through child welfare channels, that Grandpa was confused and might need to go somewhere to get better. Tyler had asked his teacher if his grandfather was sick. The teacher had noted his visible anxiety and filed a welfare observation. My phone rang at 7 on a Thursday evening. It was Nicole. Dad. Her voice had the particular texture of someone performing concern. I've been thinking about you. You seem like you're struggling. I walked to my kitchen table and pressed record on my phone before I answered her. Susan had told me to do this weeks ago. I'm fine, Nicole. Brandon and I are worried. You've been isolated since Mom died, holding on to her things, showing up to parties unannounced. You invited me to the party. Dad, listen. Her tone shifted, warmer and more dangerous. We love you. We want to make sure you're taken care of. The legal process Brandon started. It's not to hurt you. It's to protect you. From what? A pause. From yourself. From making decisions about Mom's estate that might not be in anyone's best interest. Another pause. Carefully calibrated. There are assets, Dad. In Mom's name, things that should be handled properly by someone with a clear head and good financial guidance. Brandon knows property. He can manage this correctly. All you have to do is let us help. And Tyler? Tyler will be well taken care of. We're looking at an incredible school experience for him. International, it opens doors you can't imagine. The world is different now, Dad. Kids who have global exposure. You're talking about Nassau, I said. Silence. Long and revealing. I'm talking about giving Tyler every advantage, she said finally. He has a trust fund in his name that his great-grandmother and his grandmother set up specifically so no one could redirect it, I said, including you and Brandon. The warmth left her voice entirely. Dad, you're not well. I say that with love. The way you've been acting holding onto Mom's recipe book like it's sacred. Making accusations. Brandon has doctors who can help. This doesn't have to be adversarial. Good night, Nicole. I ended the call. Susan had every word of it by 9 that night. The following week, I got a call from Tyler's school. His authorized contact list had been revised. My name had been removed. The email from Nicole to the school office said I'd been exhibiting unpredictable behavior, and for Tyler's safety they preferred contact go through her until medical matters were resolved. Tyler had been waiting for me to pick him up on Tuesday. He'd sat in the front office for 40 minutes before Nicole sent the nanny. Susan filed emergency papers that afternoon. Diane arranged a meeting with a woman I hadn't expected to hear from. Nicole's best friend from college, a woman named Patricia Gaines, who had watched the marriage to Brandon from the beginning and who had 2 weeks ago been told by Nicole to stay out of family business. Patricia came to Walt's shop on a Saturday morning with 2 screenshots on her phone and a willingness to testify. The first screenshot was a text from Nicole to Brandon. Dad still has the book. Do you think there's something actually in it? Brandon's reply. If there is, we need it before the hearing. Or we need him declared incompetent so we control the trust. The second screenshot was Nicole's text to a contact labeled Nassau agent. Can we still make January? If legal situation resolves by December, we're clear. Patricia looked at me across Walt's cluttered work table. She talked about Tyler like a problem to be relocated. Patricia said quietly, "She's not cruel the way Brandon is cruel. She's just decided Tyler is inconvenient, and she followed Brandon's lead because he told her the money would fix everything." She folded her hands. "Tyler asked me last month if I thought his grandfather was sick. I told him absolutely not. He looked so relieved I nearly cried. I thought about Maggie's letter. Your grandfather always keeps his promises." The trap, as Susan designed it, was almost too simple. Brandon believed I didn't know about the mineral rights. He believed the cognitive evaluation had been filed defensively, not proactively. He believed the hearing was 32 days of grinding me down before a judge who would see a confused old man who couldn't let go of his dead wife's recipe book. He believed he was winning. Susan called Nicole on a Monday and suggested warmly, gently, that perhaps the family could sit down together before the hearing. A mediation dinner. She framed it as an opportunity for both sides to avoid the expense and exposure of full litigation. She mentioned, carefully, that some documentation had surfaced about Maggie's estate that might benefit everyone to discuss privately. Nicole called back within the hour. Brandon wanted to meet Friday evening. Walt's neighbor lent me a wire, a small adhesive transmitter that pressed flat against my left side. Diane sat in a car on the street with a receiver. 2 plainclothes officers from the county were parked around the corner based on an emergency custody filing. Susan had placed with the family court judge that afternoon, citing imminent flight risk for Tyler. I walked into Nicole's dining room, carrying Walt's appraisal report for the Berkeley County parcel and certified copies of the deed. Tyler was at the table. He ran to me the moment I came through the door, wrapping both arms around my waist the way he'd done since he was 4 years old. "Grandpa." He was shaking slightly, which told me more about what the past weeks had felt like to him than anything else could have. Brandon sat at the head of the table looking composed, expensive, and certain. Nicole sat to his right, not quite meeting my eyes. A bottle of wine had been opened, but no one was drinking it. I sat down. Tyler stayed next to me, his shoulder against my arm. "We appreciate you coming," Brandon said. He had the manner of someone who had rehearsed his position carefully. "We all want what's best for this family. What's best for Frank, and obviously what's best for Tyler." I set the appraisal report on the table. "Maggie's recipe book had a false back cover," I said. Inside was a mineral rights deed, properly notarized, transferring 60% of the Garner Ridge parcel in Berkeley County, West Virginia, to Tyler James Patterson, held in trust until his 25th birthday, administered by me as trustee. I spread the certified copies across the table. Walt Greer appraised the mineral rights at between $8 and $12 million based on current development activity in the county. Your wife threw approximately $10 million into a recycling bin. Brandon's composure didn't collapse. It crystallized into something harder. "Those documents could be challenged," he said. "They've been reviewed by 2 attorneys, a historical document appraiser and the Berkeley County Clerk's office," I said. "They're real, Brandon. You know they're real. You pulled those county records 8 weeks ago." Nicole looked at her husband. He didn't look back. "What we're doing with the conservatorship," Brandon said carefully, "is protecting assets that need proper financial management. You're 67 years old, Frank. These are complex transactions. I need you to stop trying to take my grandson's inheritance," I said. Brandon's jaw tightened. "The trust is administered by a trustee. If the trustee is declared incompetent, the court appoints a successor. As Tyler's parent and stepfather, I would petition to Brandon." I looked at him directly. "I know about Nassau. I know about the school inquiries. I know about the Cayman accounts. I know about the Maryland Real Estate Commission review. I know about the $2 million in personal guarantees coming due in March." The wire was recording everything. I know you and Nicole have been discussing shipping Tyler to the Caribbean, so you can attempt to access his trust from a jurisdiction that complicates American oversight." Nicole made a sound. "And I know," I continued, "that you told Tyler his grandfather was sick and confused, while your wife called his school and had my name removed from his emergency contacts, while a man you paid $15,000 wrote a psychiatric evaluation calling me incompetent." I folded my hands on the table. "That's elder abuse, Brandon, and it's child endangerment, and both of those things are being reviewed by a family court judge who received an emergency filing this afternoon." The front door opened. 2 officers. Brandon stood. "This is Mr. Holt. I'm going to need you to come with us." The officer was quiet and unhurried. "We have a court order suspending your travel rights and those of Nicole Holt pending a family court hearing. We also have a warrant related to elder financial abuse and witness tampering connected to the conservatorship filing." I didn't do anything, Nicole said, but her voice had already lost its architecture. Tyler pressed against my side. I put my arm around his shoulders. A social worker came through the door behind the officers. She knelt down to Tyler's level. "Hey, buddy, your grandpa's going to stay right here, okay? You're going to be with him. We just need to sort a few things out." Tyler looked up at me. "Are you sick, Grandpa?" Brandon said. "I'm not sick," I told him. "I'm the same as I've always been. I'm right here." He nodded slowly. Then he leaned into me, the way he used to lean into Maggie, full weight, completely trusting, and I held on. The family court hearing was a Tuesday morning in December, gray and cold outside. Judge Adrienne Brooks had reviewed 3 weeks of filings before we sat down. She was methodical and unhurried, the kind of judge who had stopped being impressed by anything and had started simply being thorough. Brandon's attorney presented a conservatorship case that fell apart methodically under Susan's cross-examination. Dr. Fosse's disciplinary record. The $15,000 wire transfer. The fabricated timeline of erratic behavior that Diane had dismantled with location data and security footage showing me doing ordinary things on the days I was supposed to have been confused and dangerous. Walt testified for 30 minutes about my lucidity, precision, and genuine understanding of the documents Maggie had hidden. He described me as one of the most structurally minded people he'd known in 40 years of working with retired engineers. I testified for an hour. I described the recipe book, the false back cover, the deed, Maggie's letter. I described Tyler's face at the housewarming party when Nicole dropped the book. I spoke about what Maggie had said to me in her last week more than recipes, and I said that I hadn't known what she meant until Walt opened that false cover, and that understanding it had felt like receiving one last piece of instruction from a woman who had spent her whole life thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Judge Brooks read Tyler's guardian ad litem report, which included an interview with a child psychologist. Tyler had said, very calmly, that he wanted to live with his grandfather because his grandfather listened to him. He'd said that after his grandmother died, his grandfather was the only person who still talked about her like she was real, and not just something that had happened. The conservatorship petition was dismissed. The judge referred the elder abuse filing to the district attorney. She issued an emergency temporary guardianship to me, pending permanent custody proceedings, citing Brandon's flight research, the Nassau school inquiries, and the coordinated attempt to remove me from Tyler's emergency contacts as evidence of a systematic effort to isolate a minor from his primary protective relationship. Brandon and Nicole were granted supervised visitation only, pending resolution of the criminal referral. Outside on the courthouse steps, Susan stood beside me in her coat and said, "You did everything right." I didn't have anything to add to that. Tyler was coming home that afternoon. He arrived with a duffel bag in his backpack, walked through my front door, looked around the kitchen, and went straight to the counter where I kept Maggie's recipe book, now in a proper archival case that Walt had found for me. Tyler pressed his fingers against the cover through the acrylic panel, very gently, the same way Maggie used to touch things she wanted to last. "Can we make her pot roast Saturday?" he asked. "I'll find the recipe," I said. He pulled out a stool and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Maggie had stood and taught and fed anyone who came through the door. "Grandpa," he said, Why did Mom throw the book away? I sat across from him. I thought about how to answer that honestly, without making him carry something he didn't need to carry yet. I think she forgot what the valuable things actually look like, I said. Sometimes people spend so much time looking for something expensive that they stop recognizing what's actually worth keeping. Tyler thought about this for a moment. Grandma knew. Your grandma always knew. He pulled his homework folder out of his backpack and opened it on the table. Just like that. Like we'd done this 1,000 times. Like it was ordinary. Which was exactly what I wanted it to be. The first 3 months were made of small things. Breakfast every morning at the same table, Tyler eating cereal and telling me things about third grade that mattered an enormous amount to him and that I paid full attention to because Maggie had taught me that the conversations children think are small are never small. We drove to his therapy appointments twice a week. Dr. Hannah Reeves had an office with a fish tank and the patience of someone who understood that children who've been living in households organized around adult anxiety have learned to make themselves invisible. Tyler's job, she told me, was to practice taking up space. He started sleeping through the night around week 6. Brandon pled guilty to elder financial abuse and witness tampering in February. He received 2 years probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent bar from serving as trustee or guardian for any minor or protected person in the state of Maryland. Nicole completed parenting classes and financial counseling. She began supervised visits in March. She showed up on time. She sat on the floor and played the board games Tyler chose. She didn't touch her phone. It was not the mother Tyler deserved from the beginning. But it was a start. And I wasn't in the business of deciding whether starts were worth anything. That was Tyler's decision to make on his own timeline. I took Tyler to Berkeley County in April, when the West Virginia hills were beginning to turn. We drove Garner Ridge Road in my truck, windows down, and I showed him the land his great-great-grandparents had cleared, and the land his great-grandmother had loved, and the land his grandmother had quietly protected for decades without telling anyone. It's big, Tyler said. Almost 212 acres. He looked out at the ridge. What are we going to do with it? That's up to you, I said. When you're 25, it's yours to decide. Until then, we protect it. Like Grandma did. Like your grandmother did. He was quiet for a while, watching a hawk work the thermals above the tree line. Then he said, Grandpa, was Grandma scared when she hid the deed? Did she know they'd try to take it? I thought about Maggie in the last year of her life, making doctor's appointments and filing documents and tucking a piece of paper behind a false cover with steady hands. She hadn't been afraid. She'd been deliberate. There's a difference. She wasn't scared, I said. She was thorough. Tyler smiled at that, a full smile. The kind that had been rare in the first weeks but was coming more easily now. He had Maggie's smile. Same shape. Same unhurried arrival on his face. I want to be like that, he said. Thorough. You already are, I told him. We stayed until the sun dropped behind the ridge. Then we drove back toward Maryland with the windows down and the spring air coming in, and somewhere around Frederick Tyler fell asleep against the door with his jacket pulled up like a blanket. I drove carefully, the way you drive when you're carrying something irreplaceable. Maggie's recipe book sits in its archival case on the kitchen counter. The deed and the letter are in a fireproof safe at Susan's office, with certified copies at the Berkeley County Clerk's office, and with Walt for good measure. Maggie believed in redundancy. She believed in building protection into every structure, so that when one thing failed, something else was already holding the weight. She'd spent her last year making sure Tyler would be held. I hadn't fully understood that until Walt opened that false cover, and I felt the specific gravity of a promise I hadn't known I was keeping. But I was keeping it from the moment I reached into that recycling bin in front of 40 people who watched me and said nothing. From the moment I wiped the cover with my sleeve and looked my daughter in the eye and carried her mother's work back out to my car. Tyler asked me once, near the end of winter, why I hadn't yelled at his mother at the party. Why I'd just been quiet and left. Your grandmother taught me something, I told him. She said the loudest thing you can do is stay steady when other people expect you to fall apart. She said the people who love quietly are the ones who change things. He thought about that for 3 days. On the fourth morning, while he was eating his cereal, he said, "I think I want to be a civil engineer." "Why's that?" "Because you build things that have to hold up," he said. "Even when people try to take them down." I looked at my grandson across Maggie's table and understood that she had done exactly that. Built something that held up, quietly, without credit, for the people she loved. Every promise she made, she kept. And she made sure I would keep mine. Hello and welcome. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Father's Peaceful Revenge and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you know someone who has protected a child the way this family did, leave them a kind word below. Stories like this remind us all what actually matters. That's the legacy we choose to carry.